Intro. In the spring of 1862, as Union forces closed in on Richmond, a quiet transformation took place in the Confederate High Command. Robert E. Lee, the man who had spent most of his life building bridges, draining swamps, and teaching cadets at West Point, stepped into the firestorm of command. He was 55 years old, graying at the temples, with the bearing of an old Virginia aristocrat who had never quite shaken the dust of the Mexican War from his boots. But from the moment he took over the Army of Northern Virginia, Lee's days became something far removed from the drawing rooms and parade grounds of peacetime. They became a grinding, sleepless, mud-caked marathon on the front lines, where one wrong decision could unravel an entire army, and one moment of calm resolve could hold it together. This is the story of what that life was really like. Not the marble statue version we see in textbooks, but the raw, day-to-day reality of a general who chose to live exactly as his men did. Bobby Lee's mornings began long before most of his soldiers stirred, often by 4:30 or 5 o'clock. While the Virginia countryside was still wrapped in pre-dawn chill, he would rise from a simple cot inside his small headquarters tent. There was no grand pavilion, no cluster of servants, just a canvas shelter that leaked when it rained and flapped in the wind, the same kind issued to any private in the ranks. He slept fully dressed more often than not, boots beside the cot, overcoat ready to be thrown on. And right there, almost every morning, a small black hen named Nellie would be waiting. She had wandered into camp back in early '62 with a shipment of chickens meant for the cooking pot. Lee took one look at her, decided she belonged with him, and gave her free run of the tent. Nellie laid an egg nearly every single day, his breakfast egg, right under the edge of his cot. Staff officers joked about it, but Lee never laughed it off. He saw her as a small piece of normal life in a world gone mad, and he guarded her fiercely. Even during the frantic retreat after Gettysburg, when the army was breaking camp in the pouring rain, his aides were scrambling around shouting, "Where's the hen?" until they found her safe in her usual wagon. Lee wouldn't leave without her. He would step outside, breathe the damp air, and spend the first few minutes in prayer. Lee was a deeply religious man, and those quiet moments were non-negotiable. He carried a small Bible and read from it daily, often quoting passages about duty and endurance to himself before the day's chaos began. Then came the simple breakfast. That fresh egg if Nellie had delivered, maybe a piece of hardtack or a cornmeal mush boiled over a small fire, washed down with whatever coffee substitute the commissary could scrape together. Chicory, acorns, you name it. No luxuries. Lee refused delicacies sent by admiring civilians. If someone brought fresh butter or a ham, he thanked them graciously and sent it straight to the field hospitals. He ate exactly what his men ate, and he made sure everyone around headquarters knew it. "A soldier has a hard life and but little consideration," he once wrote, and he lived that truth every morning. By 6 o'clock, the first reports would start arriving. Aides like Colonel Walter Taylor or Major Charles Venable would appear at the tent flap with dispatches from the divisions, scout reports on Union movements, and whatever scraps of intelligence had come in during the night. Lee would sit on a camp stool, maps spread across a rough pine table, and absorb it all. He rarely raised his voice. He listened, asked quiet questions, and then gave orders in that calm, measured Virginia drawl. But make no mistake, those orders were steel. He expected speed, precision, and absolute commitment. During the 7 days battles outside Richmond in June and July of 1862, those morning briefings turned into frantic planning sessions. Lee had just taken command. The army was disorganized, and McClellan's huge Union force was only miles away. He would pore over maps until the candles burned low, then ride out himself to see the ground. Sleep was a luxury he almost never allowed himself. Staff officers remembered him going days with no more than 2 hours at a stretch, yet he never seemed to flag. "I think and work with all my power to bring the troops to the right place at the right time," he told one Prussian observer later. "Then I have done my duty. As soon as I order them into battle, I leave my army in the hands of God." Once the morning's business was sketched out, Lee would mount Traveler. That gray horse was as much a part of the daily routine as Nellie the hen. Traveler was fast, sure-footed, and tireless, qualities Lee prized because he himself was always on the move. Soldiers would see the familiar figure in the gray uniform, the wide-brimmed hat, the modest gold braid on the collar, riding up to the front lines at a steady trot. They called him Marse Robert, and the shout would ripple down the ranks. "Lee's coming! Lee's here!" More than once his men tried to pull him back from danger. "Lee to the rear!" they'd yell when artillery shells started bursting overhead. He would smile that quiet smile, touch his hat in acknowledgement, and keep riding. He believed a commander needed to see the ground, look his soldiers in the eye, and share their hardships. During the Wilderness Campaign in May 1864, when Grant's army slammed into his lines, Lee was in the saddle for hours, directing reinforcements, steadying wavering brigades. One officer recalled him sitting calmly on Traveler while Minier balls clipped leaves around him, issuing orders as if he were on a Sunday ride. Mid-morning often meant moving the entire headquarters forward. Lee refused to stay in comfortable houses behind the lines. He preferred the tent, or, when the weather turned brutal, a simple cabin if one was available. But even then, he kept it Spartan. During the winter of 1862 to 63 near Fredericksburg, his headquarters was a cluster of tents along the Rappahannock. Rain turned everything to mud, yet Lee was out every day, checking on the men's shelters, asking about their rations, listening to their complaints. He wrote home constantly during these lulls, long, tender letters to his wife Mary and their daughters back in Richmond or wherever the family had scattered. "My heart aches for our reunion," he confessed in one. "Your letters are a great comfort to me." He worried about their health, about the shortages they faced, about the future of the country. But he never complained about his own conditions. "We are without tents," he told Mary during one early campaign, "and for 2 nights I have lain buttoned up in my overcoat." That was the reality he lived with every single day. By midday, the fighting or the marching would usually be underway. Lee's style was not to micromanage once battle was joined. He positioned his forces, gave his corps commanders, Jackson, Longstreet, Hill, their tasks, and then trusted them to execute. But he was never far away. He would ride the lines, sometimes dismounting to talk with regimental officers, sometimes climbing a hill to watch the smoke rise and the lines shift. At Chancellorsville in May 1863, that trust paid off spectacularly. Lee and Jackson cooked up one of the boldest flank marches in American military history over a simple supper of cold chicken and bread. Lee barely slept that night, pacing, thinking, praying. When Jackson's corps slammed into the Union right the next day, Lee was exactly where he needed to be, holding the center, ready to exploit the breakthrough. The victory was staggering, but it cost Jackson's life. Lee felt it deeply. In the days that followed, he rode out alone more than once, the grief visible in his face, even as he kept the army moving. Afternoons blended into a blur of logistics and decisions. Supplies were always short. Lee spent hours corresponding with Richmond about shoes, ammunition, food. He railed privately at the inefficiency. "Our people are opposed to work," he wrote in frustration, but publicly he stayed positive. He would visit the field hospitals when he could, walking among the wounded, speaking gently to boys who had lost limbs or were burning with fever. One story that circulated among the troops told of Lee stopping beside a dying soldier, taking the boy's hand, and praying with him until the end. He hated the suffering, but he knew it was the price of the cause he had chosen. "What a cruel thing is war," he once wrote to Mary, "to separate and destroy families and friends and mar the purest joys and happiness God has granted us in this world." As evening approached, headquarters would settle into a new spot if the army had moved. Supper was again simple, whatever the cook could scrounge: salt pork, cornbread, maybe a few vegetables if the foragers had been lucky. Lee ate with his staff, listening to their stories, offering quiet encouragement. He had a dry sense of humor that surfaced in these moments. When one young officer complained about the rock-hard biscuits, Lee smiled and said, "You ought not to mind that. They will stick by you the longer." After supper came more paperwork by candlelight or lantern. Reports had to be read, orders drafted for the next day, letters answered. He often worked until 11 or midnight, the only sound the scratching of his pen and the occasional distant picket fire. Then, finally, a few hours of rest, fully clothed, boots ready, revolver within reach, before the whole cycle began again. Some days shattered the routine completely. During the Maryland campaign in September 1862, Lee's army was exhausted, half-starved, and strung out across the countryside when McClellan caught them at Antietam. Lee had split his forces to capture Harper's Ferry, a gamble that nearly cost him everything. He rode from one threatened sector to another, personally directing the defense of the sunken road, the bridge over Antietam Creek. When the sun set on the bloodiest single day in American history, Lee's men had held, but at terrible cost. He withdrew across the Potomac 2 days later, calm as ever, already planning the next move. At Gettysburg in July 1863, the pressure was even greater. 3 days of brutal fighting, miscommunications, heroic charges that fell short. On the third day, Lee watched Pickett's men disappear into the smoke of Cemetery Ridge, and when the survivors staggered back, he rode out to meet them. "All this has been my fault," he told them. "I and I alone am to blame." That night in his tent, he sat alone with Traveler, the weight of thousands of dead pressing down. Yet the next morning he was up at dawn, organizing the retreat, making sure the wounded were loaded first. The siege of Petersburg in 1864-65 turned daily life into a grim endurance test. Trenches, constant artillery, mud up to the knees. Lee's headquarters was a small cabin near the lines, but he was rarely inside. He rode the fortifications daily, checking on the men, bolstering morale as rations shrank to almost nothing. He slept even less now. One officer remembered finding him at 2 a.m, still studying maps by a single candle, eyes red-rimmed but mind sharp. When the final breakthrough came in April 1865, Lee was already planning the retreat to Appomattox. He kept the army moving, protected the wagons carrying the wounded, and when surrender became inevitable, he rode to meet Grant with the same quiet dignity he had shown every morning for 4 years. Through it all, Lee remained the same man his soldiers loved. They saw him share their hunger, their cold, their danger. They saw him refuse every comfort while insisting his officers do the same. They saw him pray for the enemy as well as for his own men. "We must forgive our enemies," he said more than once. "I can truly say that not a day has passed since the war began that I have not prayed for them." That compassion, paired with iron resolve, is what made his daily life on the front line so extraordinary. It wasn't glamorous. It was muddy boots, cold coffee, endless paperwork, sudden terror, and quiet moments with a little black hen and a faithful gray horse. It was the life of a commander who asked nothing of his army that he did not first demand of himself. When the war finally ended at Appomattox, Lee's soldiers wept as they stacked their rifles. Many of them had followed him through every one of those grinding days, from the 7 days to the final retreat. They knew the real man, not the legend, but the one who had risen before dawn, prayed, eaten the same meager rations, ridden into the fire, and carried the weight of an entire nation on his shoulders without complaint. Robert E. Lee's crazy daily life on the front lines was not the stuff of romantic paintings. It was sacrifice, faith, and unrelenting duty lived one muddy, exhausting, determined day at a time. And that, more than any single victory or defeat, is why his men loved him then, and why his story still echoes more than a century and a half later.